Okay, I think we've got a good threshold. So welcome. This is the LaRouche PAC Monday night strategic briefing and discussion. I know that over the last couple of weeks, people have had a number of thoughts and initiatives on economic outreach and a sense of how we move the nation forward. So hopefully we can continue that tonight. Bob Ingraham is going to give us kind of an overview of what is the tragic comic event of the G20 and COP26, and a general sense of how that presents what's actually taking place on a global scale. So Bob will jump in here in a few minutes. Let me just situate the discussion tonight with an even broader overview. Let's kind of take ourselves up to the moon or even beyond and look at this place called Earth and what's actually defining Earth in a way that only a human being could understand. Because that's always the most important strategic angle, is what's unique to human beings. And the main question that I think is undeniable for anyone sitting in the United States or in the civilization today is that the globalist regime, the post-World War II kind of hijacking of the United States, which maybe began even at the turn of the 20th century, but was certainly completed with the death of FDR over the last 75 years. This regime, this post-war globalist, typified by the EU, by the British Crown, who's all over these G20 and COP26 events, this globalist outlook, hyper-finance, globalization, deindustrialization. Can you imagine that was a word that was applied to economic policy? Controlled disintegration. That was a policy. This period of 75 years, the so-called legacies of things like civil rights or the green agenda or the hippies and the counterculture, all of those things are brought to the fag end of what is clearly kind of a collapsing society. But the people in that society, collapsing in terms of production, manufacturing, not just in the United States, not just in the West, on a global scale, the production of basic raw materials, energy supply, basic commodities, food supply, that system has broken down. That this regime has become incapable of sustaining this. There have been parallels. These parallels will be discussed, I think, more in depth by Tony Papert on Saturday night. One of which is the Weimar regime of Germany, which was pressed by globalist programs, largely the Crown in Great Britain, into a policy of near-term failure from the Versailles Treaty. The other example is the Soviet system, where they were unable to meet the basic necessities of the population's existence. But it's not just an inability to meet that in terms of policy or physical mechanics. It's the culture as a whole, which has led people to not only have those policies pushed, but that they accepted them. And that's the unique circumstance in the United States today. The American people are not inclined to be pessimistic, to be cynical, to blame others. The pulling yourself up by your bootstraps is an American reflex. And so we're not inclined to say the world is just screwed up by all these other people. That's what the Squad, the Bernie, the apocalyptic greenheads, people push these kinds of outlooks. But at core, the American people are saying, no, we can govern. I don't care if I've been a reggae, pot-smoking reggae band member who now does real estate. I mean, and this is I can run this society better than these freaks can, better than Joe Biden, better than Jen Psaki, better than the creeps in Congress or the Senate. And that's true. Many people have some sense of physical production, physical industry, whatever it might be, but a sense of reality. That's an impulse and reflex that we may take for granted in the American culture. but is certainly alive and vibrant today. You saw it in New York City. About a week ago, there was a major walkout of tens of thousands of people against the mandates. These are firefighters, first responders, police, trash, public health, airline pilots, even basketball stars like Kyrie Irving aren't taking it. It's not flying. The mandate, the idea that you're going to tell the American people what to do and shove it down their throats is not happening. We have an American reflex or Lincoln reflex-like moment, and that defines the world. Because there are factions in every country in Europe, despite the oppression of the EU, and there are growing movements all in every country around the world. But the question we're going to discuss tonight, we want to get your feedback and thoughts, is once we overthrow this regime, what do we do then? What are the initial steps we have to take as a civilization? If you were president, what steps would you insist we take? Are you prepared to do that? And if not, then start to get prepared, start thinking about the questions, start thinking about the policies and measures you would be prepared to move on, to make sure that we secure the means of production for the American people and provide that opportunity to any sentient people on this planet. Because that's the stakes. This regime is dying. We are going to replace it. But then we have to, like Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin knew, we have to know how we're going to keep the republic for generations to come. So on that note, Bob, I think we're all excited to hear what you've got to say and what these creeps are doing running around unfortunate Scotland today.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mike. Hello, folks. So, well, we're going to have a little bit of fun here. There was an article that I wrote, which was published on the LaRouche PAC website several days ago, entitled October 30th, 31st G20 meeting, Rome fiddles while the world burns. And you could get it on our website. And that was sort of a article that was written giving people a sense of what the developments were going into the G20 heads of states meeting in Rome, Italy. I'm going to begin by just sort of that, since that conference is now over, that was a sort of seen as a preparatory conference for COP26. So I'll just give people a brief sense of what came out of that G20 meeting. I will say that I'm going to cover a number of things, but it's all going to lead to a more serious point, more serious discussion that I want to arrive at by the end of this presentation. And I'm not going to tell people what that is now. We'll get there. But this is not intended just as a report on what went on in Rome or what's going on in Glasgow. But as Mike was saying, the implications of what we need to do, what governments need to do, what our policy needs to be, as opposed to just sort of showing how crazy these other people are. Now, in terms of the G20 meeting, going into it, as I reported, people were saying, this is going to be a failure, this is going to be a failure, this is going to be a failure. And, they had the conference, it took 2 days, and it was a complete failure, even from their standpoint. Virtually no governments there would agree to specific restrictions or specific policies on carbon reduction or anything related to climate change. All of the final statements that were issued were watered down. There were really only two things that they agreed to. One was that they would agree not to sell any more, to build any more coal-fired generating plants, electrical generating plants in the third world, in Africa, South America, or any of these other places, that they would stop doing that. So, they agreed on one thing, which is to kill a lot of people. And secondly, they agreed that that there should be a global corporate tax rate. Now, I'm not going to get into that tonight. That's a long discussion. But this is on setting a minimum rate. I think it was 15% in every country for a tax on corporations. Now, the problem there, they all agreed to it, but the problem there is that this has to be actually enforced by all of the individual nations. So whether nations will actually do that or not remains to be seen. Biden is trying to get a big corporate tax increase through Congress right now, and it remains to be seen whether he's going to be able to do that. But that's it. Out of sort of a pledge to raise corporate taxes and an agreement to stop building coal-fired plants in third world countries, nothing else came out of the G20 meeting. At the end of it, they all just sort of wandered away. There was a sense that nothing whatsoever was accomplished. And in fact, this is where I'd like you to put up that picture, Mike, if you can. This is how the G20 meeting ended. They all got together. And they went to Trevi Fountain, which is this very famous fountain in Rome. And you could see that what they're doing is they're throwing coins in the fountain over their shoulders. This is what you do when you go to the Trevi Fountain. You throw coins in the fountain. You're actually supposed to throw 3 coins in, but I don't think they did that. One of the things that's funny about this picture is that this is the group of 20, and there's only 15 people in the picture. Now, 4 heads of state didn't go to Rome. Putin and Xi Jinping and 2 others. But 4 from 20 leaves 16, and there's only 15 there. And the person who is missing is Joe Biden. So maybe this was considered too strenuous of an activity for him by his handlers. It's hard to say what exactly why he didn't show up, but he didn't show up at it. I mean, it's just the height of absurdity. They have a conference, they accomplish nothing, and they go throw coins in the fountain. I mean, what you would expect them to do next, is to jump in the water and start yelling Marcello, Marcello. But if you don't know the reference there, I'll explain it later if someone wants to ask. But it is just, it's like something out of a bizarre movie. So that was the end of the G20 conference. It ended very unceremoniously, and then they all began moving on to Glasgow. So you can take the picture down, Mike. All right. So the utter failure and fiasco of the G20 meeting was quickly followed up by a whole series of fiascos going into Glasgow. I mean, first of all, as I reported, I think last week or something, or maybe in the article, they don't even have enough hotel rooms for everybody. But going into the conference on Halloween, as people were traveling there, Scotland was hit with huge storms, ice storms, heavy winds, torrential downpours, even tornadoes. There were tornadoes reported. Power lines went down. And what happened is that a lot of the delegates who were traveling to Glasgow were traveling by train. And the train line stopped. In some cases, the power lines went down that were powering the railroads. So you have literally hundreds, maybe thousands, but certainly hundreds of people who are stranded on these on these trains for hours with storms raging outside. People were, you know, texting and calling, saying, we're stuck here. It's a nightmare. So this is what kicks the thing, what kicks off the whole thing. Then they get to Glasgow, and it's announced that there is a garbage man strike, and that for the tenure of the conference, none of the streets are going to be swept, none of the garbage is going to be picked up. So this is what they get, as they arrive. The accommodations are all screwed up. They have a meeting hall. Their main negotiating room has a capacity for 144 people with the COVID social distancing, and they're going to abide by that. And but the problem is that the number of delegates who are supposed to attend these sessions are over 190, I think 193. So there's 50 delegates who can't even get into the main negotiating room where the negotiations are going on. And otherwise, there's Greta Thunberg and these teams of lunatics, roaming all over the place, denouncing everyone, blocking streets, holding rallies. And then when the delegates get to the conference, and this was reported this morning, actually, yesterday was sort of the registration and what have you. Today was really the first day of the conference. And when these people arrived there, they couldn't get in. There were these huge queues. There were thousands of delegates in line, sometimes for hours. It's icy, stormy weather. They're standing around outside. They're all miserable. One delegate who was stuck in line for a long time sent out a tweet saying, "There is a real feeling of chaos here as the world leaders are arriving." So this is how the whole thing is initiated. It's just, these are the people who want to run the world, and they can't even organize a conference. Now, going into the G20 meeting, there were all of these world leaders and all of these United Nations people and other people who were saying, nothing is going to get accomplished. No one is really committed to this. Well, those kind of, warnings, that sort of hysteria has deepened going into COP26. And even after the first day of the conference, the conference is over. Well, I'm in California, and I think Glasgow is 9 hours later from here. The first day of the conference is over, and people have already started sending out messages saying that this is a nightmare. Nothing is going to get accomplished here. No one wants to agree to anything. Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, sent out a message saying, we are not going to hit the goals. We have to be honest with ourselves. If we are going to prevent COP26 from being a total failure, then this must change. And I must be clear, if Glasgow fails, then the whole thing fails. So that was a message Boris Johnson sent out today. And that is typical of what these various organizers of the conference are saying. Prince Charles gave a speech. Also, Queen Elizabeth recorded a message, which I won't go into, but she recorded a message saying, which was played for people at the conference, a video message saying, you must do this, you must do this. But Prince Charles gave a speech today in which he said, ladies and gentlemen, quite literally, This is the last chance saloon. We must now translate fine words into finer solutions, finer actions. Um, the UN General Secretary or Secretary General Antonio Guterres sent out a number of tweets today. In one of those tweets, he said, "Well, I welcome the G20's recommitment to global solutions. Um, I go into COP26 with my hopes unfulfilled." And then he sent out a second tweet saying, "All countries need to realize that the old carbon burning model of development is a death sentence. We need decarbonization now in every country." And then he sent out a third tweet. So he's clearly very agitated. He sent out a third tweet in which he said, the the 6 years since the Paris Climate Agreement have been the 6 hottest years on record. Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We face a stark choice. Either we stop it or it stops us. It's time to say enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves. So this is a Secretary General Secretary General of the United Nations. So that sort of calls into question anybody's faith in that organization. But it's total. It's they're totally wigged out, and and they're just it's like they're pounding. They're all turning into Greta Thunberg is what's happening. They're pounding the table, saying we must do this, we must do this, we must crush all opposition, et cetera, et cetera. Now, unfortunately for them, governments really aren't going along. What you've got is Xi Jinping, who's not at the conference, sent a written message, which was a written address, which was read. He didn't even provide he appeared on video at the G20 meeting, but at COP26 he didn't even record a video. He sent a written address, which was read, and in that address, as has been pointed out by all of the observers, he refused to commit China to any specific deadlines. He made no new pledges. He said, yes, we're for this. We're all for it. We know climate change is a threat. We're committed to, solving this problem, but he did not commit China to anything specific, to any, so it's, and that was the tone from a number of countries. I don't think Putin has addressed COP26, unless I missed it. Maybe he's speaking tomorrow. But Vladimir Putin gave 2 speeches at the G20 meeting, and he was not there, but these were 2 video speeches at G20, and there was good and bad in his speeches. In the second speech he gave, which was much worse than the first speech, he said, he was, we recognize this is a threat. We're committed to dealing with this. We're going to do our part, et cetera, et cetera. It was a pretty bad speech. But in the first speech he gave, he said that we are going to provide whatever amount of electricity or energy is needed for our population. He said, it is essential for the modern world to have a stable and reliable energy sector, and that supplying affordable energy to consumers is extremely important. And that's the message from a number of these people. That Modi spoke today at COP26, and he did make a pledge to being net zero by, I think, 2070, which is beyond what everyone is demanding. But it was 2070 is a long time from now. And he also made it clear that India is a developing country and that they cannot cut back on electricity production. They cannot reduce their energy production, or they cannot commit national suicide. And he didn't. And outside of this, sort of semi-vague commitment to net zero energy 50 years from now, he didn't really commit India to anything specific. So what the Queen said prior to the G20 meeting was that nations are doing a lot of talking, but they're not taking a lot of action, and that which she was very irritated about, and that clearly seems to be the case at this point. So the conference is going to continue. There's going to be more speeches tomorrow. I think there's 2 to 3 days of speeches by these various heads of states, and then the conference is a 12-day conference. But after the first 3 days, a lot of it is going to devolve into workshops, negotiations, trying to hammer out an agreement which governments may or may not implement. So a lot of it is going to become somewhat mechanical as the days proceed. We'll just have to see how important any of it is. But it is certainly not off to a very good start. There's a huge amount of hype about it, a huge amount of hoopla. But this prediction that governments may not act is clearly not just a prediction. It's somewhat of a reality. Now, this brings up another question, though, which is that in his speech of Prince Charles, where he was saying, I'm not going to look for the exact quote, where he was making all these dire predictions. What he did say is he was chiding governments for their failure to act. But what he did say is he said the corporations are with us. Now, in I think the last one of these videos I did, or maybe it was in my article, I talked about this question of green finance. And what you have to realize here is part of the strategy, and this is, they don't say this explicitly. Some of them almost do say it explicitly, but it's very, very clear, is that what they're relying on is the central banking system, the financial sector, and the corporate sector to really be the enforcers of these policies. That governments, essentially, they recognize that sovereign governments are a roadblock, and they're not confident they can overcome that roadblock. They're trying, right? But they're not confident they can get governments to go along. But what they're looking at is the banking and corporate sector, as the means to do this. And this sort of interconnects with the activities of the World Economic Forum and the Davos crowd. That they, the Klaus Schwab Build Back Better, stakeholder values and all of this stuff, that if they can, and you look at what is I already reported on, which I'm not going to go over again tonight, in terms of this question of green finance, and which Mark Carney and a number of other people are involved in getting all of the banking systems, the central banks, the major private banks, the big mega banks like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, all these other banks, European banks, to essentially sign on to a series of protocols which they will begin to enforce independent of government, to take steps to decarbonize the economy, to refuse to make loans for any projects or any investments that are going to add to carbon emissions. This is clearly, a major way in which the House of Windsor and all of their friends intend to get to their goal. And they are essentially trying to create a situation in which governments will be forced to go along, in which this policy can be locked in, through the private sector. This gets to this whole question of big government. Government is the problem. Well, I tell you, for the House of Windsor, for Mark Carney, for Klaus Schwab, for these ghouls in Glasgow, it is very clear that for them, sovereign government is the problem. And they intend to use the private sector and the financial institutions and the power of the City of London and Wall Street to try to force governments to go in this direction, right? So I'm not going to say any more about that now, but if people want to bring it up in the discussion period, I can. I'm going to keep this presentation short tonight so we can have a lot of room for discussion. But I want to get to the point that I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that I was going to get to, which is that you have this problem right now where governments are resisting, and there's a factional situation in all these governments. And in some cases, the factional situation is very acute. I mean, for instance, I have been looking into the situation in China. It would take too long to go into this in any detail tonight. But this is a very, very intense, this question of climate change and following, the guidelines coming out of the Paris Climate Accords, coming out of the United Nations. This is a very intense factional situation in China. I know less about the situation in Russia, but I know it's factional there. And what you've got are governments that are sort of trying to straddle the fence or trying to resist in certain actions they take, without really breaking with this climate change policy. And this is suicidal, and it won't work. And what it also indicates is that many of these leaders in these nations do not really understand the kind of fight we're in. And on this question of climate change, I'll read to you a little quote, which I actually heard someone else say it, but I thought it was appropriate. So I'm going to repeat it. And the quote is, once you concede to the principle of something, it is very hard to avoid the practice. And that, that doesn't exactly fit, but it's close enough in my mind that if you give speeches in which you say, we agree entirely with the aims of the Paris Climate Accords, we agree entirely with the need to reduce carbon emissions, we agree entirely with a goal of a net zero, carbon economy. If you give speech after speech saying that, then ultimately you're not going to be able to avoid in practice the implications of that. You can't have it both ways. And this is what these countries are doing. The resistance is good and it gives us an opening. But it is ultimately doomed to failure if that's all it is. And I will give you, there's one thing before I get to my final point that I want to mention, which is to give you an example of what real leadership can do, which is the, just find the page here. Yeah, here it is. As people know, when Donald Trump came into office, he withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords. Xi Jinping did not withdraw. Vladimir Putin did not withdraw. None of these other people withdrew. Trump withdrew and said, we're not going to do this. I don't agree with it. It's going to destroy the United States. This is his whole thing, or his thing about making America energy independent was part of this, right? But it was bigger than just that. He simply ignored all of the, provisions of the Paris Climate Accords. Now, what some people are not aware of is that Trump's action not only allowed him to do a lot of things in terms of rebuilding the US economy, but it had an international impact. And I was reading some stuff on the impact it had in China. And I read something by a guy named Li Yongfang, who is the director of the National Center for Climate Change Strategy. And he reported that that after Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, he said, quote, some comrades in China immediately said, now that the Americans have quit the Paris Agreement, why should China limit its coal capacity? And so in 2017, China loosened restrictions all of a sudden and began approving several coal chemical heavy chemical and coal powered projects. And they went on to say that this led into an increase in steel production and led into many other kinds of investments in 2017, 2018, 2019, and led to an increase in steel output, coal production beyond what had existed before 2015. This continued until orders came from Xi Jinping, or I believe from Xi Jinping, certainly from the Standing Committee of the Politburo, to stop it. And they began to clamp down on this. And now they're in a situation where, with the electricity blackouts, they're starting to loosen things up again a little bit. But the point I'm making here is that because of what Trump did, that the Paris Climate Accords, as they were agreed to, could not be implemented globally that countries really did almost nothing between 2015 and 2020 in terms of implementing the Paris Climate Accords because of what Trump did. That if, say, Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, you wouldn't have all these people today, pulling their hair out, gnashing their teeth, and screaming, governments haven't done anything, governments haven't done anything. Governments around the world pulled back from their commitments at the Paris Climate Accords because of the action that Trump took, right? And this shows what can be done in terms of using the power of sovereign government to defeat these ghouls, these satanic ghouls. So, look, the final thing that I just want to say, and this is really the subject of a much, much longer discussion, but, you could go through, what occurred at the G20, what's occurring at COP26. But the wrong way to think about it is in terms of climate. Climate is just a means, the climate change policy is a means to an end for this imperial faction. And, without getting into a long discussion, I want to just try to situate, where, what this climate thing is really all about, because it really is just a means to an end. Now, as many people on this call know, Lyndon LaRouche always pointed to the decision made by Richard Nixon in August of 1971 to terminate the Bretton Woods system as a turning point, as a key turning point in post-war history. And a lot of people today, probably the vast majority of people, and a lot of people who are getting active politically today don't understand that. But I want to pose it in a slightly different way, which is that it was not just, this was not a, people say Nixon made this bad decision. Well, he did make this bad decision. But why? Why did he make it? It wasn't just a decision by Richard Nixon. What you had was the Bretton Woods monetary system, which essentially, as it was established, created a stable world monetary system, essentially within the constraints, not perfectly, but essentially within the constraints of U.S. constitutional law, right? And it was an agreement among sovereign nations, and it restricted and limited the financial oligarchy from what they could do and couldn't do. Now, beginning in 1964, the British began to attack this, and they carried out a 7-year campaign. You could call it a 7 years war, but a 7-year effort from 1964 to 1971 to bring down the Bretton Woods system. This was initiated under the government of Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister. And it began with them unleashing a sterling crisis, a crisis of the British pound sterling in 1964, which continued and worsened and was manipulated from the City of London, resulting in a devaluation of the British pound in 1966. And then that devaluation of the British pound further spun out, causing more and more monetary, banking, and financial instability, which grew and escalated from 1966 to 1971. This all came out of the Harold Wilson government. It all came out of the City of London banking establishment, and it was all aimed at bringing down and abolishing the Bretton Woods system. And they succeeded. So after 1971, what you got was a second campaign. The first campaign was to bring down Bretton Woods. The second campaign, beginning in 1971, was the creation of a globalist, the creation of what you might call the final British Empire, a permanent global financial and oligarchical dictatorship in which nation states would simply become the enforcers, or the people who nation states, the sovereignty of nations would be destroyed. And Tony Papert has recommended an article from LaRouche, who's, if Tony wants to post it on chat or something, I don't have it right in front of me, but it was an article that I read yesterday, and there's one little quote from Lynn. It's only 3 lines that I'll read here, where Lynn and LaRouche says, "The end of history would be the establishment of a permanent world empire called globalization. The end of history, because it was determined that there would be nothing to come after the establishment of the Anglo-Dutch liberal system's version of a new, truly worldwide and eternal Roman Empire, as Shelburne's Gibbon had intended." And this is really how you have to situate COP26. We're at, they are driving relentlessly towards the imposition of a global empire, the complete elimination of national economic sovereignty, in which you will not be allowed to invest in anything or build anything, without the approval of, the financial oligarchy. This is what they're aiming at. It's not about the environment, really. It really has nothing to do with the environment. It's what, coming with the destruction of the Bretton Woods system. The aim has been the creation of a new global empire, a permanent empire, a financial empire, overriding all national sovereignty. And the hysteria they have right now is that countries aren't going along. But as I said, the fact that countries are not going along is not good enough, because they have the City of London, they have the European Central Bank, they have the Federal Reserve, they have this vast array of financial power and corporate power they can bring to bear. What is required is national sovereignty. What is required is a total break with this. This is what's addressed in the resolution to re-Americanize the American economy that we have been circulating. This is why we have to take our government back in the United States. And that's the fight. That's the task. So I think I will just stop there, and we can open it up for discussion. Okay?